Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we have several Russian advances. In the Ukrainian Kursk incursion, the Russians have advanced in the western parts of it. In the Toretsk direction, the Russians advanced in the southern flank of the settlement. The Russians have advanced all across the southern section of the Donetsk region near Velika Novosilka, Korokhove, and in the northern flanks as well. The Russians have also advanced in the direction of the Zaporizhia section of the front line. In the Kursk direction, the Ukrainians managed to counterattack and regain some positions outside of the settlement. This brings me to a conclusion with regards to this section of the front line. Starting out in the south, the Russians have managed to advance here near Bilohirya, reaching the outskirts of the settlement and aligning the front line near the Kunka river line, crossing it in the northern parts through Lhivske and reaching the outskirts of the settlement from the north, while fighting also has appeared in the southern flank of the settlement. It seems the Russians are approaching the settlement in an attempt to gain control of it. Towards the Velika Novosilka direction, the Russians have advanced west of Makarivka along the fortified positions, improving the positions near Rivnopil in an attempt to develop offensive operations in the western flank of Velika Novosilka to hit the supply road going in and out of Velika Novosilka through Remivka. The Russians continue their attempts to cut off the supplies of Velika Novosilka both in the western direction but also in the direction of Rostelne itself, where the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians to the western outskirts of the settlement and practically out of the settlement itself, while they also advance on the flanks of it, both in the northern and southern flank. The objective of the Russians is to reach the fortified positions near the road, connecting Velika Novosilka in the south with Pokrovsk in the north. This highway goes through Andriivka and Konstantinopel here, moves towards Bahatir, and where there's a significant fortified position there as well, before they go through towards Velika Novosilka. And the Russians are fighting over the fortified position down here to cut off the supplies going through there. The alternate route for the Ukrainians is to go through Bahatir down towards Kuman and down south towards Velika Novosilka. If the Russians push through following the captured fortified position to Novi Kumar, they will cut off that road as well. And with a push from the western flank, they can cut off the final road. This would leave only open fields to resupply Velika Novosilka and a wider supply line, which would be under Russian fire control with the close proximity to it. This means that the Russians would operationally encircle Velika Novosilka. While the Russians have gained a foothold within the settlement, it is likely they will continue pushing through at the same time as they attack the flanks. A general objective of the Russians is not just to operationally encircle settlements, but also to draw in as many Ukrainian soldiers as possible, which results in the so-called meat grinder strategy. The objective of the Russians is to force the Ukrainians to send as many reinforcements as possible towards a settlement that they have control over the supply lines. The reason for this is the more activity there is in and out of the settlement and within the settlement itself, the more targets there are for the Russian artillery. When the Ukrainians are on the move going in or out of a settlement, that is when they are the most vulnerable. That means the longer fighting takes place over a settlement the Russians have operationally encircled, the better it is for the Russians in terms of inflicting casualties on the Ukrainians. When the Ukrainians attempt to withdraw from a settlement, that is when the Russians look to gain full control of it as fast as possible to catch them in their withdrawal. Before they establish positions further on their back, they'll look to take advantage of the capture to then break through the defenses. This is what happened in the Avdiivka direction during that battle. The Russians had control over most of the supply lines. The Ukrainians decided to withdraw due to the heavy FAB bombs that had landed on the settlements. The city faced up to 100 FAB 500s a day. This forced the Ukrainians to withdraw from the settlement. During the withdrawal, the Russians looked to take advantage of it to attempt a breakthrough, which allowed them to capture several settlements west of Avdiivka, and the Ukrainians, constantly withdrawing from settlement to settlement due to the inability to establish a front line, took a lot of casualties during the withdrawal itself. Back to the south of Korokhove, the Russians have advanced in the direction of Rusliv, where they are moving from field to forest line and continuing slowly up towards Rusliv. This is a start of new offensive operations following the stabilization of the front line and the consolidation of the gains of the capture of Maximivka, Yasna Polyana, and the rest of the settlements here to the south. The Russians also continued their offensive operations in the pocket south of Korokhove, where they've managed to capture Yelisavetivka and are now moving towards Vasiliy, Romanivka, and Hanivka in the eastern direction. They're also fighting in Trudova to the south. There's no offensive operations towards Uspenivka yet. There's heavily fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the area, which requires a larger contingent of Russian forces to fight that. Instead, the Russians are moving north of Dalye in an attempt to storm Korokhove from the southern direction. This is to gain control over the apartment complex area in the southern parts of Korokhove, and at the same time to consolidate their positions here south of Korokhove to establish an additional supply line in and out of the settlement through the main highway going through Marinka or the south of the settlement. This will strengthen the Russian supplies in the area and allow the Russians to start the battles over the high-rise apartment complex area in the western parts of the city. The Russians continued offensive operations in the south and within Korokhove itself. In the northern flank, the Russians have managed to secure Berezky, except for the very western outskirts where two Ukrainian fortified positions are established, which the Russians have to capture if they are to secure a supply route between Voznesenka and Berezky to then push towards Staryeternyi from the east. At the same time, there's a possibility of a Russian push from Sunsivka in the north down to Staryeternyi in the south. However, the Russians also need to secure the western parts of Sunsivka. If we look further north, the front line has been established, but near Sunsivka, the Russians have yet to connect the Surya and Sunsivka directions, and they also need to secure the river line and first lines here west of Sunsivka. Therefore, the Russians will look to gain control over this part before moving down south towards Staryeternyi and Shevchenko, while at the same time they'll fight over the fortified positions near Berezky before moving towards Staryeternyi from the east. This will allow the Russians to have the railway under their control all the way from Selidove in the north and down towards Berezky in the south. The Russians would look to push further along the railways towards Pokrovsk in the north as well. The heavy fighting continues on both flanks of Korokhove, both the northern and southern directions, and within the settlement itself. North of Pustinka, the Russians are advancing to the right flank of Shofte, where they're looking to flank it from the railway direction. They've also advanced to the south and along the eastern bank of the reservoir here near Shofte to get close to the settlement and storm the settlement itself, but so far the Russians have yet to storm it. They are fighting positionally on the outskirts of it, where the Ukrainians have established strong defensive positions here in the high grounds just north of Shofte. As we can see, this is Shofte. The Ukrainian defensive positions are located on the high ground, and just below them are the settlements, which are mostly located in the low ground. This means the Russians moving through the settlements would have to go down onto the low ground before fighting over the fortified positions in the high ground just north of them. This makes it difficult for the Russians to break through that defensive line. And this is why they're heavily relying on the railways, which hardly go down in elevation. They're mostly located on the high ground. And at the same time, they have their positions near Novokhodivka, which they use to hit the Ukrainian defensive positions from the east, which is from the high ground towards the low ground. So the main push will likely come from Novokhodivka, but an additional push will come from the south to spread out the Ukrainian forces and allow the Russians to make a stronger push in the east. All of these offensive operations coming from the west of Selidove is all in preparation for the Battle of Pokrovsk, which will be from a wide front from the Sivka in the east to Novotroitske in the west. In the southern flank of Toretsk, the Russians have managed to recapture the hospitals and are pushing the Ukrainians back to the high ground south of it. This is negating some of the Ukrainian counterattacks that they managed to achieve this month. At the same time, the Russians are also fighting within the southern district of Toretsk, where heavy fighting is taking place. So the Russians continue their offensive operations in Toretsk, both in the southern and central and northern parts of the settlement, while the Ukrainians are still able to make some localized counterattacks as well due to their control over the high grounds here in the western parts of the city. In the Torske direction, the Ukrainians have managed to recapture the outskirts of Torske, pushing the Russians further back from the settlement. And this actually made me realize something, and that is the 15-kilometer radius from Lyman. There's the western outskirts, eastern outskirts, northern outskirts of Lyman. And then there's a 15-kilometer range. It goes somewhere around here. So this area right here is an area where Ukrainian FPV drone operators, artillery, and so on can constantly operate and have good information. while the Russians would have to push through open fields for the most part. This makes it very difficult for the Russians to push through this radius around Lyman, and this is exactly what makes it so difficult for the Russians to push into Terny, Polivka, and Torske. Naturally, the Russians would be able to overcome this if they concentrate a lot of resources in the area, if they heavily bombarded Lyman with FAB bombs. But the thing is, it's just generally around Lyman where the supplies would be. The Ukrainian FPV drone operators would likely operate from the forest patches in the area. There's the Serbianki forest area, which is massive, and the Ukrainian FPV drone operators can be anywhere within them, and it'll be difficult to spot them. They can also be in the surrounding settlements, and this makes it very difficult for the Russians to operate in this direction. Lyman itself is also a large logistical hub. This means a lot of supplies comes to this area, and the Ukrainians simply do not run out of supplies in this section of the front line, and this allows them to constantly strike any Russian positions here in the east to hold the Serbs river line. Therefore, it is more likely that the Russians will achieve success in the Kupiansk direction towards Borova and then advance further down south alongside the Oskar river line than them striking Lyman head-on, unless they concentrate enough resources to do so, which will also cause a lot of casualties. Therefore, it is unlikely that they'll use such a strategy. But the current strategy they're doing with small assault groups is simply not working in this section of the front line, and it's extremely difficult for the Russians to succeed with such operations. In the Kursk direction, the Russians have managed to advance further down south from Zeleny Shliach in the direction of Svetlikovo, where they are now very close to the settlements, being within 3 kilometers of it. The Russians have now also broken through the defensive line of the Ukrainians, and with this, the Russians are now one step away from the Battle of Svetlikovo, which could lead to the road here between Svetlikovo and Sucha being practically open. The Russians would then fight over Luknia and Lebedivka here in the south, which would hit the supply lines going to and from the northern pocket here north of the Kursk incursion. The advance was confirmed with this geolocated footage, and with this we see that the Russians are one step closer to the end of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion with this operation. However, there's just a tiny step. A much bigger step would be the capture of Svetlikovo. Following that would be the beginning of the Battle of Sucha, which would happen from the eastern and western directions towards the settlement itself, which would both cut off the supplies going in the northern direction to Malaya Luknia, as well as in the eastern direction towards Martianovka. So this would be a huge hit to the supplies of the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians would be forced to strengthen their defenses by Sucha. Otherwise, the forces in the northern direction would be cut off from supplies and would be in a very difficult position. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.